Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Alexandra Novitskaya. Alexandra is a 2023-2024 Title VIII Research Fellow at the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. She holds a PhD in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies from Stony Brook University, and her Wilson Center research project is titled New Queer Dissidents: Politics and Geopolitics of the Post-Soviet LGBTQ Migration to the United States. Alexandra, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So before we dig into the details of your research, I just want to ask you sort of the behind the scenes question. You know, I think of academics almost like doctors, right? Where initially your research is broad and then you have to pick a specialization. So how did you end up in this lane as your specialization?
All right. Okay. So no, it's an excellent question. It's a great way to start. So thank you, John. So, all right. So about 10 years ago, I was, actually, it'll be 10 years next year. So I was applying for graduate school. I was living in the United States at the time already, but I just left Russia myself a couple years prior. And so just, I think it's to give you a couple of relevant details of my background is that I was born and raised, well, in Leningrad and St. Petersburg. And sometime I studied philosophy at St. Petersburg State University, graduated in the late 2000s. And then as I was thinking of what else I should be doing with my life, I became closely involved with the nascent LGBTQ advocacy in St. Petersburg at the time. And specifically what I was doing was, well, I think some people might call it cultural activism. I was an interpreter and a translator for Side by Side, which was an LGBTQ film festival that also was just getting started in St. Petersburg at the time. And what they did is that once a year they held a film festival showing films, documentaries, and motion pictures from all over the world that had to do with LGBTQ subjects. And I was part of the team that translated those films for the festival. And that volunteer work became very important for me because it really gave me an entry into the world of LGBTQ advocacy. And at the same time also, so that was a couple of years into that work. So in 2011, 2012, some might remember that was the year when the State Duma in Russia held elections, which were seen as highly fraudulent. Well, the results of the elections were seen as highly fraudulent, and people in many cities all over Russia hit the streets protesting the outcomes of the elections. And then which then became even a more wider, massive anti-government protest. And that also at the same time, St. Petersburg, my hometown, became one of the became a ground zero for political and state-sponsored homophobia, is what I'd call it now today, which is that in the fall of 2011, the city assembly introduced a legislative proposal that would prohibit the so-called gay propaganda of LGBTQ related information to minors. And so these two, like a bigger event, right, the protest all over Russia, and then maybe somewhat of a smaller but just as well important event in St. Petersburg, coincided in time. And what happened is that LGBTQ activists joined the mass protest, protesting the government together with all the other members of the opposition for the first time in Russia's history. And I witnessed all that and participated to some degree too. And then the next year, but however, what happened is that, again, for those who may not remember or may not know, is that the wave of the mass protests in Russia turned out to be largely, well, some would say not very successful, because it did not stop Vladimir Putin from returning to presidency the following year, and it did not annul the results of the fraudulent elections, the fraudulent results. Similarly, the gay propaganda ban in St. Petersburg was eventually passed in the spring of 2012. So on the one hand, yeah, some people might say that all this activity, all this protest was not successful, but at the same time, what I witnessed and what I also write about in my work is that this was the beginning of a large social change in Russia, right? Both for the larger, for the bigger, well, for the big, really for the majority of the population, but also for the LGBTQ activists that I knew, and because the well, the existence of the emergence of state-sponsored persecution mobilized the community and mobilized the activists and even legitimized what they were doing. Nevertheless, so that, and I apologize if I gave you maybe a little too detailed of a background, but what happened eventually is that I left Russia and then I found myself in New York City, applying for graduate school here in New York. And I always wanted to do, always wanted to do gender and sexuality studies as a subject that, in my opinion, is just perfect for analyzing, for investigating the intersection of the personal and political, right? Because on the one hand, gender and sexuality is what every person has, right? And it really, it might be like some of the most private traits of sides of a person's identity. And yet at the same time, as history has shown over and over, gender and sexuality become vectors of oppression again and again. And people's rights can be threatened because of their gender and sexual identities. And by studying gender and sexuality, I'm able to see how it happens. I'm able to try and figure out the mechanisms of oppression and resistance.
So, Alexandra, thank you for sharing that story, because, it's a long and winding road to where you are today, and very interesting one as well. I want to follow up on the part you said about the intersection between the political and the personal. You used the phrase, I wrote it down, political and state-sponsored homophobia. My question is, how much of this is deeply held beliefs by the legislators who are essentially creating less tolerant laws in Russia than had been enjoyed previously? And how much of it is purely political, playing to a certain narrative about history, maybe narrative about Russia? Can you sort that out?
Thank you for this question. Another great one, John. So, all right. To some extent, this might be a bit of a, well, okay, this might be a question that might not be so easy to answer, like to give a clear-cut answer to why, right? So on the one hand, we can never, as scientists, as scholars, we can never truly know what people think, what people believe when they say one thing or another, right? When they act on, enact a legislation or introduce a policy change, especially speaking of public officials, of the authorities, of the representatives of the government. I'm not sure if I should call them elected officials speaking of Russia, but let's say still officials, right? The political elites, even more so. So we can never truly know what they think or what they believe. All we have is what they say, right? Their statements and their actions, right? So their proposed or actualized policy changes, legislative proposals, and laws that they enact, and also what some might call dog whistling, right? So like things people say maybe without immediately asking, or demanding.
We understand the concept of political dog whistles here in the U.S. very well.
I think you do.
Unfortunately,
I think you do very well. But and so back to but to give you more specifics, I would like to actually bring up a research project that I've been working on with my colleagues, political scientists Valerie Sperling and Janet Ellis Johnson and Lisa McIntosh-Sunster. What we did is that we were interested in whether there was a change, a noticeable, traceable change in what President Putin has been saying about women's rights and gender equality over the years, given how long he's been in power. And so what we did is that we took the transcripts of his major public speeches that he used to give annually, so such as the New Year's Eve address, the International Women's Day address, the big press conference, the direct call-in line, right, when anyone supposedly can call Putin and ask a question, right, or complain, and his Federal Assembly address. And we coded, right? So we searched the transcripts. We coded every term that we thought was relevant for our questions. So gender, women's rights, equality, men's rights, fathers, mothers, really everything that had to do with gender and sexuality, LGBTQ, right, or like homosexuality, things like that. And what we discovered that indeed there was a change. But even before I go into that, the first thing that we discovered was that Putin has not really been saying that much about women's rights or gender equality over the years. We published this research. If you like, I'll be happy to share links to this work, so you could look at the graphs, the pie charts that we have there. But really, of all the subjects and topics Putin has addressed over the years in these speeches, gender equality is not even in the top 10, and never was. However, when we did look at what he's been saying, we noticed a change that reflected almost one for one the change in Russia's general positioning in the world, let's say, right? The change in Russia's foreign relations, its geopolitical stance. For example, during the first two terms of Putin's presidency in the early 2000s, when the scholars, my colleagues, as my colleagues have observed, it's possible. Russia still, Putin still viewed Russia as part of Europe, right? And still preferred collaboration, right, to confrontation. What he used to say about gender equality was almost feminist in some ways, right? Like in 2002, speaking to a group of women working for a textile factory outside Moscow, Putin said that, women have been contributing to the society just as much as men have, but their contributions have not always been as recognized as seen. And today, and he was going to give out some awards, and so today he said, I'd like to amend this problem here. And or at some other point, when asked about Russia's demographic crisis, right, the low birth rate, Putin said that what was happening to Russia was typical for post-industrial states, and similar processes were taking place elsewhere in the West, in Europe and the United States, which is that families become smaller, women choose to have less children, and so in itself it was not really like Russia-specific problem. But that was almost 20 years ago, right? But as the further Russia was moving away, right, and moving toward the confrontation with the West, with Western countries, the more Putin's rhetoric around women's rights and gender equality, and then later also LGBTQ rights, which he did not really mention early on in his presidential career, the more his statements became conservative, the more they became about like traditional values, right? And then the concept of traditional values itself, became a part of the public discourse in Russia, like full on adopted by the state, maybe just slightly over 10 years ago, with Putin's return to the third term, right, following the mass protests that I mentioned. And so to use this example to answer your question, John, I think there is definitely a degree of instrumentalization that's been happening, at least as far as Vladimir Putin's rhetoric regarding gender and sexuality is concerned. Again, I don't think I can answer definitely.
No, it's impossible to prove intent, right? That's the toughest thing to do in a legal proceeding as well. And I know it's a tough question. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on it. On Vladimir Putin, so would you say that this has made him more popular with the Russian people? Do you have any insight into popular support for either more or less tolerance versus more tolerance? Because one of the strange things we've seen, right, and I'm sure you've seen this, is in an odd turn of events, Vladimir Putin has become a bit of a darling of the far right in the United States, who like those so-called traditional values and aren't supportive of gay rights.
Yeah, well, that's a great question too. Let's talk about this. So I think it's important also to just, when we talk about traditional values, to actually take the concept and try to like deconstruct it, or at least pull it apart and try to get as close as possible to what we actually mean when we say traditional values. And I think the American alt-right's concept of traditional values, did I say traditional rights? I meant traditional values.
Yes.
And Vladimir Putin's concept of traditional values, or even like a more generic Russian concept of traditional values, may not be the same traditional values.
Yeah, whose traditions, whose values, right?
Yeah. What I mean by this is that Russia, well, as the post-Soviet state, has had decades long legacy of state-sponsored, let's call it that, feminism, or state-promoted gender equality to a degree, right? Soviet women received, were emancipated, or again, as some of my colleagues would say, and I think I'd agree with them, mobilized, right? Were mobilized into the workforce equally or almost on the equal terms with men very early on, like in the 1920s, if not even earlier. One of the first decrees passed by the Bolshevik government was a change in family law, easy divorce, right? Easy divorce, no difference between the rights of children born to a married couple to those born to single parents, right? Single mothers, reproductive rights, abortion, easy access to abortion. Soviet women received all those rights right away. That's not to say it was because the Bolshevik government was so feminist and so woman friendly, but it was because the country needed to modernize and they needed its women, right, and to get them into the workforce. But at the same time, and then yes, there were like moments in the Soviet history when the state walked back on some of those rights for women, such as banning abortion during Stalin, under Stalin. But at the same time, Soviet women still enjoyed, or at least had access to, and some of them probably did enjoy much more equality than their American counterparts. And even today, when we look at the American far right aspirations, right? let's go with aspirations for bringing traditional family values back to the American mainstream. They probably imagine, they definitely would like to limit women's access to reproductive rights as much as possible, ban abortion everywhere, limit, if not entirely do away with LGBTQ rights, all of that. If we look at President Putin's understanding of traditional values, we'll still see a reluctance toward limiting women's rights. Right, the Russian government that instrumentalizes homophobia, homo and transphobia now to the fullest degree, but it is not as fast, not as quick when it comes to women's rights. Although I do want to say that I have been observing some concerning developments, literally within the last year, or even like within the past few weeks, when it comes to restrictions on women's rights in Russia, and especially when it comes to their access to reproductive rights. In several regions, private health clinics suddenly decided to voluntarily stop providing access to abortion to women. The church, the Russian Orthodox Church, which has enjoyed a very cozy relationship with the Kremlin, has been the main cheerleader of this change. And I think actually today I was just reading in the news that Vladimir Putin gave an address at a large religious gathering, the church gathering, in which he spoke about the necessity to increase the size of the Russian family, saying that it would be ideal if Russian families had 5 to 7 children. And right, and so that is different even from a year ago. That is different from 2 years ago or a couple years ago, when someone asked Putin about, during one of those public events, the direct line, I think.
The Russian economy would not do a great job of supporting people with 5 to 7 children.
No, not at all. But but the church leaders, the Patriarch Kirill, for example, right? They are happy to hear that.
Yeah.
They're cheering, right? They're cheering on. And so again, it's too early to make any conclusions, I think, but because Putin has literally just said it today, and so we have not yet seen
Yeah.
whether his
See how it
words are going
goes.
to have.
Let me ask you about the migration to the United States
Sure.
part of your research.
Yeah.
What talk about volume and what you've seen, and is this a major movement of people?
Okay, so right, so actually that'll take me back to your first question, which I think I never fully gave you an answer to, so I'm going to try and fix it right now. So yeah, around 10 years ago, I was in graduate school, and I was thinking of what I was going to do for my dissertation. I was interested in the consequences of the so-called gay propaganda law, which also had just been passed in Russia on a federal level in 2013. And so I was living in New York, and what I noticed is that more and more LGBTQ identified people, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, transgender people from Russia, but also from other post-Soviet states such as Belarus or Kazakhstan, Ukraine too, and others, Kyrgyzstan, started just like arriving in New York City. I had maybe a few acquaintances who introduced me to more people and more and more. And so at the same time, their first publications began to appear on in the Radio Liberty, right? Or yeah, on Radio Liberty about the growing numbers of asylum seekers from Russia specifically, following Putin's return to presidency in 2012 and the passing of the gay propaganda law in 2013. And so I started meeting new people who just arrived in, around 2013, 2014. Many had stories to tell, and they really wanted to tell their stories to anyone who would listen, including myself. And so the stories were absolutely terrifying. So the people I met were used to be involved in LGBTQ rights advocacy in Russia until they found themselves being, for example, surveyed, watched by the FSB or other authorities, or outed at work, that is, right, their sexual or gender identities revealed to the public without their knowledge or consent, and which regularly resulted in these people losing their jobs, right, getting fired, sometimes losing housing, and losing personal safety, most importantly. And so for many, immigration became an answer or some sort of a solution. It's not like everyone wanted, some people even just wanted to leave Russia for a little bit. And so somebody had a visa to the United States, and that was all they had. And so they hopped on the plane and ended up in New York. And then they realized that they could not return because more and more reports of anti-queer, anti-LGBTQ violence began appearing in the news, and it became less and less safe just to be a queer LGBTQ Russian person. And so speaking of numbers, so it's a tricky question too, because the Department of Homeland Security, which oversees asylum applications in this country, does not disclose exact numbers of the categories of asylum applications. And what I mean by that is that in this country, a person can apply for political asylum due to a fear of persecution based on several categories, such as their ethnicity, their race, their political opinion or activity, their nationality, their religion, or a membership in a particular social group. And this last category is usually what LGBTQ asylum seekers choose as why they need protection, as why they apply for asylum. But so it is possible to go on the Department of Homeland Security's website and look and check the numbers of asylum applications by country annually. But it is impossible to see who applied claiming what, right? Whether it was religious persecution, whether it was political opinion, which also I believe is a large category of political asylum seekers from Russia have, well, as their claim, because of participation in street protests now can supporting Navalny can now be quite a serious, could put a person in a serious danger of persecution in Russia. And LGBTQ asylum seekers typically choose the membership in a particular social group, but that information is not disclosed. So what I do have is that I have just general numbers. I have numbers of all political asylum applications from nationals of post-Soviet countries, Russia and others. And I think last time I checked, I looked at the years 2012 to 2020. And what I did see is that there was an increase across the board, except for maybe Tajikistan. The sheer numbers were different. Of course, most applications were coming in from Russian citizens, and followed by Ukrainians, followed by Kazakhstanis, and so on. But what I'm trying to say is that, yes, every year there were more applications.
So Alexandra, for our viewers who are interested in digging even deeper than we have the time to do today, well, is there where can they turn? Is there ways that you share your research? Is it available online or any place?
Well, okay, so this particular table will appear in my book once the book is published, but that is still a work in progress. And thank you to the Wilson Center and Kennan Institute for giving me the fellowship. That really has been already very helpful in just giving me the time to focus on the book project. But it's not yet published; it's not yet out. So it will be out there in an aggregated form.
Well, thank you, Will. We all look forward to the book. I won't put any pressure on you by asking you when it will be published, because I know that authors hate to hear that question. But I'm glad that your experience here at Kennan has been positive in that regard, because, you know, we can, here at the Wilson Center, we're often an author's best friend because we give you that time to focus. Thank you for sharing your insights with us today. Any final thoughts before we close?
Well, thank you for inviting me for the interview. I enjoyed every second of it. And if anyone in the audience, once they get to watch it, would like to talk to me, right, reach out, they're welcome to reach out. My email address is on Kennan Institute website, and I would be delighted to share.
Great. And we'll make sure we'll put it on the website where people can reach you in that regard. Thank you. That's very generous of you. So, Alexandra, thank you very much for joining us today, and best of luck as you continue reach when you get closer and closer to the actual publication. Would love to talk to you again at that point as well.
Right. Thank you.
Excellent. Our guest has been Alexandra Novitskaya. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thank you for your time and interest.